Hello, welcome to Mysterios Divinos podcast. Today we're diving deep into one of the Bible's weirdest and most fascinating mysteries. This is a story that has stumped scholars for centuries, and honestly, it sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel. We're talking about the Nephilim.
You see, the Bible talks about these beings of just incredible size and power, walking the earth way back in ancient times. They're called the Nephilim, the mighty men of old. But who were they, really? And what if their story is pointing to something way beyond what we think we know about the ancient world?
All right, so let's get right into it. If we're going to unravel this mystery, we have to go back to the source, right? So our investigation kicks off in the book of Genesis, chapter 6. And this is where we find these beings placed at a really specific and super important moment in human history.
Okay, now the timing here is what gets really interesting. Genesis says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Now think about that. This means they weren't just some pre-flood thing that got washed away in the Great Flood. No, this suggests they showed up twice, two separate appearances. And that just makes the whole mystery even deeper.
So who were these guys exactly? Well, the scriptures actually give us these scattered little details, but when you put them together, they're surprisingly consistent. It's like we can build a case file, a profile of the Nephilim. And let me tell you, it's as fascinating as it is terrifying. So let's check out the evidence.
And the picture that starts to form is pretty wild. First off, they were giants, like extremely tall. They were also famous for being incredible warriors in battle. And here's a weird detail. The Bible only ever talks about them being male. No female Nephilim are ever mentioned. On top of that, they're pretty much always described as just pure evil, a really bad influence on people. Some accounts even mention birth defects, like having 6 fingers or 6 toes. And this is a key point. They went by other names in the Old Testament too, names like the Anakites or the Rephaim.
So just to give you an idea of their size, let's talk about their most famous descendant, Goliath, right? Even using the most conservative, the smallest measurement of the Hebrew cubit, Goliath was at least 9 feet 9 inches tall. Let that sink in. That is almost 3 feet taller than the tallest NBA players walking the court today.
And get this, Goliath wasn't even the biggest one. The Bible also talks about this guy, Og, the king of Bashan. His bed, his iron bed, was over 13 feet long. Can you imagine? This points to a being of just staggering size. We're not just talking about tall guys here. This is a whole different scale of being.
So the physical story of the Nephilim, at least on Earth, seems to wrap up during the time of King David. His special forces, his elite warriors known as the Mighty Men, they're the ones who get credit for hunting down and taking out the last of these giants. But, their end doesn't solve the mystery. It just makes that central question even bigger. What were they?
And this is where things take a turn. We're moving from ancient history into modern science. Because when you actually look at the descriptions of the Nephilim through the lens of, physics and biology, you run into a huge problem, a massive one. Their very existence seems to break the fundamental laws of our world.
Okay, so think of it like this. Some people call it the physics of basketball. We all know that once a person gets over 7 feet tall, their mobility starts to go downhill fast. Gravity just puts an incredible strain on their heart, their bones, their joints. But the Bible doesn't describe the Nephilim as slow or clumsy. No way. It describes them as elite warriors, guys who could carry hundreds of pounds of armor and weapons into battle. That combination of massive size and incredible agility, it's a physical paradox. It just shouldn't be possible.
And the astrophysicist Hugh Ross sums it up perfectly. He says a purely human being that tall just couldn't function. They'd be crushed by their own weight, unable to even get out of a wheelchair. And that is a really stark conclusion. It tells us we're probably not just dealing with some weird genetic fluke here. This is pointing to something else, something not of this world.
So if their biology is impossible, what's the explanation? Well, that leads us right to the main theory about where the Nephilim came from. And Genesis 6 doesn't just tell us about the giants, it tells us how they were made, and their parentage. Well, that's the key that unlocks this whole thing. The text is pretty explicit. It says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, human women, and took them as wives. And their kids? Their offspring were the Nephilim. So the whole debate, the whole mystery, boils down to one phrase. Who or what were these sons of God? Were they just men or something else?
If you actually look at how that phrase, sons of God, is used throughout the Bible, a really clear pattern emerges. In the Old Testament, before Pentecost, every time you see sons of God, it's talking about angelic beings, not people. It's only after Pentecost, in the New Testament, that believers in Christ start being called children of God.
And that distinction, both in language and in theology, is absolutely crucial. It's a huge clue. It strongly suggests that the fathers of the Nephilim were not human. They were non-human, supernatural beings. And if their fathers were angels, well, then their impossible, physics-defying bodies suddenly start to make a very chilling kind of sense, don't they?
Now, if this theory is right, it completely changes how we see the Nephilim story. It stops being just a weird little footnote in ancient history and becomes something much bigger. It becomes a window into a massive, ongoing cosmic conflict that's happening just behind the curtain of our own world. Take a look at the book of Jude. It talks about a very specific group of fallen angels, the ones who left their proper dwelling. They abandoned their post, so to speak. And for that crime, they were locked away in a special prison called the Abyss. A lot of scholars believe this passage is talking directly about the sons of God from Genesis, that their great sin was crossing a forbidden line, the boundary between the spiritual world and our physical one.
And this whole idea plugs right into a central theme of the Bible, that the biggest battles in history aren't just human ones. You know, like the Apostle Paul wrote, our real fight isn't against flesh and blood, but against these rulers and authorities in the unseen world. When you look at it that way, the Nephilim start to look like the physical evidence of that unseen war breaking out onto our own battlefield. So that leaves us with this final massive question. If this theory is true, if these giants really were the children of a forbidden union between angels and humans, what does that tell us about reality? It would mean that the wall between our world and the unseen realm is maybe not as solid as we like to think. And it would mean that unseen forces have, at times, directly stepped into our world to influence and maybe even corrupt the entire course of human history.
The story of the Nephilim is, without a doubt, a deep mystery. It's a peek into a past that might be way stranger than any of us can imagine. If you liked the video, subscribe, leave a like, comment on what you liked most, and share the video.